The national park stretched for thousands of square miles. It was a land of stark contrasts, where time-weathered rocky ridges plunged abruptly into bottomless canyons, and dense, nearly impenetrable coniferous forests gave way to swift, frothing rivers and vast, little-explored swamps. Its eastern boundary jutted into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, climbing towards jagged peaks capped with eternal snows, while the western slopes, softened by the damp Pacific air, dissolved into a thick, multi-layered forest canopy. There were no wide, manicured hiking trails in the usual sense. Most routes were little more than faint deer trails or old logging roads, long abandoned and overgrown. This was not merely a scenic recreation area, but a complex, demanding environment, its own area of operations. The weather here could change without warning. A clear, sunny morning could turn into a storm with driving rain and hail within an hour. In summer, temperatures plummeted sharply with the onset of twilight, and in winter, blizzards could isolate entire sections of the park for weeks. Getting lost here, even just a few hundred yards from a known point, or sustaining a serious injury, a fracture, a deep cut, severe hypothermia, almost certainly meant a slow death without timely assistance. Cell service was non-existent across most of the territory. Rescue, if it came at all, required time and the efforts of hundreds of people, often risking their own lives. The daily work of rangers in this remote sector of the park bore little resemblance to relaxed strolls on equipped trails. John viewed each patrol as a reconnaissance mission. It was a methodical, step-by-step sweep of an assigned sector. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the surroundings, the upper forest canopy for movement or broken tops, the undergrowth for unusual tracks or displaced vegetation, the ground beneath his feet for prints, fallen objects, or signs of activity. His hearing registered and analyzed every sound: bird songs, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. Any deviation from the norm was noted. Checking the campsites, scattered significant distances apart and often difficult to access, was essentially area control. Rangers assessed the condition of the sites, the presence of trash, signs of illegal activity, fires outside designated areas, tree cutting. Conversations with the rare tourists or local residents encountered on the park's periphery were intelligence gathering. Rumors, observations, complaints, all were filtered and analyzed for useful intel. The equipment, reliable four-wheel drive pickups for dirt roads and ATVs for traversing the most rugged terrain, wasn't just transportation, but support vehicles, requiring constant maintenance and readiness checks. The reporting, which had to be kept for every patrol, every contact, every discovery, was in essence a field report, a dry, factual account of events, observations, and conclusions. Administrative work, drafting plans, coordinating actions with other rangers or services, rarely and when necessary. This was logistics and staff work. John Adams, more often called simply Chief by his colleagues, didn't quite look like the typical image of a national park ranger. There was no outward geniality or careless relaxation in his appearance. He had a close-cropped haircut, a face weathered by sun and wind, and a direct, penetrating gaze. He moved sparingly, without wasted motion, with the efficiency of a man accustomed to long treks under load in full gear. His ranger uniform was always spotlessly clean and pressed, his equipment functional, placed exactly where it needed to be. The first patrol through John's eyes was nothing like a stroll. Walking the barely discernible trail, he constantly scanned the environment. His eyes moved quickly, latching onto the slightest details. Here a branch was broken off 7 feet from the ground, too high for a normal deer or bear. Here a rock looked as if it had been recently moved. Was there fresh earth underneath? And here an unnatural silence from the birds in a sector 200 yards ahead. What could have scared them off? Each such observation instantly triggered an internal analysis. What is this? Where did it come from? What potential threat or information does it carry? This was an automatic, subconscious situational analysis and reconnaissance, a mode of thinking deeply ingrained over many years. His team consisted of 2 people, Sarah Evans and David Chen. Sarah was an experienced ranger who had worked in the park for many years. She knew the local flora and fauna better than any textbook, could read the forest like an open book, and importantly, had a knack for dealing with local residents, farmers, hunters, owners of small sawmills or tourist lodges on the park's periphery. John valued her as a local expert and liaison, capable of gathering valuable information from informal sources. David Chen, in contrast, was a new recruit. He had extensive book knowledge in biology, ecology, cartography, but catastrophically lacked field experience. He was enthusiastic, diligent, but naive. John saw him as a junior officer with no field experience, who needed not only to be trained in the basics of ranger work, but also to be constantly supervised and protected from mistakes that could cost a life in this wild territory. John led the team with the clarity and conciseness he was accustomed to from his military service. His commands were direct, sometimes seemed excessively strict for civilian work, but were always effective. He delegated tasks based on each person's strengths. There were occasional frictions with Sarah due to differences in approach. Her traditional, softer style of ranger work conflicted with his militarized approach, but there was deep professional respect between them, based on Sarah's years of experience and John's obvious competence. David looked up to John with almost reverent fear, trying to absorb every movement and word. Late in one patrol, while examining a remote creek with Sarah, John noticed something that truly made him stop. It wasn't just odd. It absolutely broke the pattern of everything he had seen in the wilderness before. On the wet bank, where he would usually see tracks of deer, raccoons, or occasionally a bear, there was a print. Large, with several toes, but not a paw, and 2. Human in shape, but much bigger. He took out a small folding ruler from his gear pocket, placed it next to the track, and photographed it with his phone. Without classifying it as a major incident yet, he made a detailed note in his waterproof notebook. It was just another entry in his internal or external observation log, requiring further analysis. John Adams' path from Marine to Senior Park Ranger was paved with harsh discipline, constant risk, and a specific set of skills honed to perfection. He served in the United States Marine Corps, spending most of his career in reconnaissance units, the so-called reconnaissance battalions, or recon. This was not standard infantry. Recon operatives were specialists in intelligence gathering, deep penetration behind enemy lines, clandestine observation, target acquisition, and, when the situation demanded, delivering precision strikes or conducting extraction operations. Their training was comprehensive and grueling. It included not only physical endurance and weapons proficiency, but also wilderness survival in the harshest environments, from deserts to mountain forests. Tracking was one of the key disciplines. the ability to read the ground, predict enemy actions from the faintest signs, distinguish fresh tracks from old ones, determine weight, direction, and speed of movement. John learned to blend into the terrain, using shadows and natural cover, moving silently over any surface. Map reading and navigation, both with traditional maps and compass and with advanced GPS devices, were second nature to him. He was proficient with all types of observation equipment, from high-powered binoculars to thermal imagers and night vision devices. Tactical communication, encryption, combat first aid, all became part of his daily routine. His service record included deployments to active conflict zones, Iraq, Afghanistan. John didn't like talking about it. It wasn't a subject for bravado. He had seen the true horrors of war, made decisions on which the lives of his men and the success of the mission depended while under fire. He had seen death, lost comrades he had known for years, with whom he had shared their last MRE and the last yards to safety. This experience left a lasting impact. It explained his reserve, his almost pathological pragmatism, his readiness for the worst-case scenario, and a complete lack of illusions about human nature or nature itself. John knew that the world could be incredibly brutal, unjust, and unpredictable. Concepts of good and evil in war blurred into simple survival and mission accomplishment. Transitioning to civilian life after leaving the military was difficult. A world where he didn't have to constantly scan the horizon for snipers or check the road for IEDs seemed both too simple and too complex. Simple everyday problems seemed trivial compared to life-threatening danger, but their sheer number and uncertainty were paralyzing. Life without the clear structure of orders and objectives, without the brotherhood of men who completely trusted each other with their lives, felt empty. Why did he choose ranger work? Perhaps it was a subconscious search for a semblance of that structure, a need to protect his territory this time, the wilderness, not abstract national interests. Perhaps it was a desire to return to life in nature, where the rules, the laws of survival, were more straightforward and honest than the complex, often hypocritical rules of human society. The national park became his new area of operations. His home, located on the edge of the forest, near the park boundary, was not just a dwelling, but rather a well-equipped and secured base. It was a sturdy log cabin, but its windows were fitted with reinforced frames, and the doors had heavy-duty steel locks. The basement stored an impressive stock of food, water, and medical supplies, enough to survive several weeks of isolation. The location of the house was not chosen by chance. It provided quick access to key points within his assigned sector of the park. In one room, a large, detailed map of the area marked with John's notations hung on the wall, and beside it stood communication equipment. Not just a standard ranger radio, but something more powerful and reliable, perhaps old military equipment adapted for civilian frequencies. John's gear also differed from the standard ranger kit. He, of course, had the usual uniform, first aid kit, compass, and radio. But added to this were personal items chosen with military-grade perfectionism. The knife on his belt was not just a tool, but a high-quality, fixed-blade combat knife. His binoculars were specialized with a rangefinder and ballistic reticle. His GPS navigator had advanced features, including the ability to create custom maps and log detailed tracks. A 12-gauge shotgun was always kept under the seat of his pickup, not so much for hunting as for self-defense in the wilderness. And his proficiency with this weapon, as well as his standard issue service pistol, significantly exceeded typical ranger training. He was always prepared for any eventuality. John didn't see the park as a pastoral landscape filled with cute critters and singing birds. In his perception, it was territory that needed to be controlled, secured, and monitored. There were friendly forces, his team, law-abiding tourists, lawful hunters during season. There were potentially hostile poachers, vandals, dangerous animals like grizzly bears or mountain lions, and there were unknowns, entities, or phenomena that could disrupt stability. Every patrol was recon for him, every encounter a contact, every incident, from a lost tourist to a discovered trap, an incident within the AO. An important element of his work, perceived as an intelligence network, was building relationships with the local population. Farmers whose lands bordered the park, hunters who knew every ravine, owners of small lodges or stores in adjacent settlements. All of them could be sources of information. John didn't just talk to them. He listened. He listened to rumors about oddities in the woods, about missing animals, about unusual sounds, about places better not to go. He didn't take everything at face value, understanding people's tendency towards exaggeration and superstition, but he recorded every potential piece of intel. Sarah, with her many years of experience and her integration into the local community, was an invaluable asset in creating and maintaining this network. She could get information where an official inquiry or a direct question from a government man would only elicit silence or evasive answers. Gradually, the oddities that John had initially only noted in his internal observation log began to become more frequent and noticeable not only to him, but also to Sarah and David. They ceased being isolated anomalies, transforming into a disturbing pattern. Tourists who made it to the ranger office or were met on the rare trails complained about the absence of the usual animals. The customary herds of deer, always numerous in certain meadows, seemed to have vanished. Squirrels were less often seen, and birdsong in some sectors of the park fell silent for hours. Fishermen who had cast their lines for years in the same lakes or river bends, always full of fish, now left empty-handed, shrugging in confusion. The forest in these areas seemed empty, unnaturally quiet, lacking its usual hustle and bustle of life. Particularly disturbing was the unusual behavior of the animals they did encounter. John observed a herd of deer, about a dozen head, which ran out of the deep woods in clear panic. They were running headlong, heedless of their path, paying no attention to the presence of humans, a typical behavior for usually cautious animals. Predators, bears, mountain lions, coyotes also acted strangely. Some seemed unusually skittish, vanishing instantly at the slightest sound, something not seen in them before. Others, conversely, exhibited unprovoked aggression, growling and adopting threatening postures with no apparent reason, as if they themselves were in a state of intense stress or fear of something larger. Birds didn't just fall silent. They seemed to abandon entire sectors of the forest, leaving behind a ringing, oppressive silence. Alongside this, the rangers began to discover new, even more distinct and numerous strange tracks. They appeared in remote areas where few people ever ventured, but sometimes also near patrol routes. John methodically examined each track. He crouched down, studied the shape, the size. Some were up to 15 inches long, with several toes ending in something like claws. But unlike the prints of any known regional predator, he assessed the depth, indicating the creature's weight and the peculiarities of how the limbs were placed during movement. A wide stance, a long stride. He photographed each track with a scale ruler beside it, as if it were a crime scene. He compared them with the tracks of all known animals, using his extensive knowledge of tracking and field guides. There was no resemblance. For him, these were unidentified tracks, potentially belonging to a target, an unknown biological entity. Besides the tracks, eerie sounds began to appear. They carried through the forest, especially at dusk and during the night. Low-frequency, vibrating sounds that seemed to resonate in the chest. They were unlike a wolf's howl, a bear's growl, or the cry of any raptor John or Sarah knew. Sometimes they resembled something between the snapping of breaking bones and a raspy, heavy breathing. These sounds evoked an instinctive, primal fear tensing every muscle. John tried to determine the direction and distance to the source, using his trained hearing, as if it were a source of enemy fire or enemy movement. But the sounds seemed to move with incredible speed or emanate from multiple points at once. Soon, the rangers began discovering the first carcasses of dead animals. These were not simply the remains of conventional predation. The locations of the finds were often remote and difficult to access. Examination of the carcasses revealed specific damage. The usual signs of butchery left by wolves, coyotes, or mountain lions were absent: clean bites, tears in specific locations. Instead, there were lacerated wounds inflicted with immense force. Strange marks remained on some bones, as if they had been gnawed on or broken with unusual force or method. In some cases, despite the severe damage to the carcass, there was strikingly little blood on the ground around it, as if the animal had been almost completely drained of blood before or during the butchery. John documented everything with painstaking precision. Photos from various angles, notes on the carcass's condition, the ambient temperature, the approximate time of death. It was akin to field forensics or damage analysis at the scene. John began looking for patterns in all these finds. He unrolled a large topographical map of the park in his office and began plotting points. Locations where strange tracks were found. Places where tourists complained about the silence. Locations where dead animals were discovered. Sectors where unusual sounds were heard. He used multicolored markers, connected the points, trying to identify an activity zone, movement patterns, possible rendezvous points or hunting grounds of the unknowns. This was a process of intelligence analysis, building a model of the enemy's behavior based on available information. The growing number of anomalies began to take a toll on the team. Sarah, who had worked in the park for many years and knew all its quirks, expressed deep concern. She recalled old local legends, stories about creatures living in the deepest woods that she had previously dismissed as nothing more than superstitions. Now those stories seemed less implausible. David was frankly terrified. His book knowledge offered no explanations for what was happening. The science he studied described a world where such things simply didn't exist. He felt disoriented and vulnerable. Both of them looked to John, seeking reassurance and strength. John remained outwardly calm, his face retaining its usual imperturbable expression. But inner tension grew with each new track or carcass discovered. For him, this was an unknown threat, and his mind had already begun developing a response plan. The most terrifying discovery awaited them. One day, while exploring a particularly remote and difficult-to-access canyon where few people ever ventured, John and his team discovered a sight that sent them into shock. It was the harvest of an unknown predator, a sight that went beyond the usual natural cycle of life and death. In a relatively small area, perhaps half the size of a football field, lay a large number of dead animals: deer, elk, even a few black bears. This was unlike natural death or the work of typical predators who leave behind scraps. This was a slaughter, a scene of complete systematic annihilation. John, despite the shock of the scale of what he saw, instantly switched into incident analysis mode. He began a detailed examination of the carcasses. The nature of the damage was striking. Not just bites and lacerated wounds as from wolves or mountain lions. Bones were broken with incredible force, often shattered as if under a powerful press. Certain organs were missing from some carcasses: liver, heart, kidneys, removed with a precision uncharacteristic of an animal predator. Strange marks remained on the bones, resembling those left by very sharp, thin teeth or claws, but corresponding to no known animal. Unlike usual butchery sites where there was a lot of blood, here there was strikingly little. It looked as if the carcasses had been almost completely drained of blood, perhaps elsewhere, or the blood had been drunk. John noted what was left and what had been taken. This suggested a very specific, perhaps ritualistic or simply extremely efficient method of feeding. The team discussed what they had seen, trying to find a rational explanation. Sarah suggested an attack by an unusually large wolf pack, or a group of mountain lions, or even a lone, unusually large and aggressive grizzly bear. John methodically debunked each hypothesis, pointing to specific details inconsistent with known predators. "A wolf tears, but it won't break an elk's femur like this," John said, pointing to a shattered bone. "A bear can break bones, but it won't extract organs with such precision. And they leave different marks on bones. A cougar strangles, but it doesn't orchestrate a slaughter on this scale. This is different, utterly different." He spoke with the certainty of an expert who had analyzed combat damage on both human bodies and equipment for years. His knowledge of anatomy and methods of inflicting harm was extensive. David, pale from what he saw, muttered under his breath, fumbling with his tablet connected to the ranger office's satellite internet. He was searching for information in academic databases and specialized forums. There are mentions," he began uncertainly, "in cryptozoology. Creatures that could theoretically inhabit places like this, or fit the descriptions: tall, agile, predatory humanoid creatures from the deep woods." He recalled local legends he had studied as folklore, now taking on a frightening relevance. He struggled to utter the names or descriptions he found. John did not immediately dismiss David's hypothesis as campfire stories. For him, a cryptid was just an unclassified biological entity or an unknown variable in the equation. He didn't believe in myths. He believed in data. If the data, the tracks, the nature of the damage to carcasses, the strange sounds, the animal behavior, indicated the existence of something that didn't fit into scientific classification, then the data has changed. And when the data changes, protocols must be adapted. He instructed David to gather maximum information on the subject, everything he could find, as if compiling a dossier on a new adversary. He needed any information that could help them understand what they were dealing with. The constant encounter with such gruesome finds began to seriously weigh on the nerves of the entire team. David became skittish, starting at every rustle in the woods. Sarah, though she held up better, looked drawn and worried. They increasingly turned to John, looking to him for support and answers. John remained outwardly impassive, his movements precise, his voice steady. But internally, he acknowledged the seriousness of the threat. He understood that their peacekeeping work of protecting the park was transforming into something else entirely. He began mentally revising their rules of engagement and contingency plans in the event of direct contact. They lacked the training for this kind of threat. Based on the analysis of the kill patterns and the nature of the damage, John came to an even more disturbing conclusion. This wasn't the blind instinct of a predator killing for sustenance. There was a certain methodology, an efficiency in selecting victims and removing organs, perhaps even a selectivity. The creatures doing this possessed a level of intelligence surpassing ordinary animals. This changed everything. They weren't just game that could be scared away or shot. This was a potentially intelligent adversary, operating by its own, as yet unclear, rules. And this was the most dangerous discovery. With the realization that they were dealing not just with an aggressive animal, but with a potentially intelligent, unknown entity, John changed tactics. Patrolling became more intense and focused. They were conducted not only during the day but also at dusk and dawn, potential activity times for the target. Routes were planned in close proximity to the zones where anomalies were discovered, but with consideration for rapid withdrawal. The team moved through the forest more cautiously, using the skills in stealth movement that John tried to instill in David. Sarah, as an experienced tracker, already possessed many of these skills, but John added tactical nuances: how to use terrain for cover, how to mask tracks, how to move as a group while maintaining visual contact. During these heightened patrols, the first visual contacts with the cryptids began to occur. These were not long, clear observations. More often than not, they were fleeting silhouettes seen at the periphery of vision, or quick movements in the dense trees. Tall, slender figures that seemed to move with incredible speed and silence. They looked like animated shadows, vanishing instantly the moment he focused his gaze on them. John tried to use his binoculars, but by the time he managed to raise them and aim, the creatures were gone. Based on these fleeting observations, as well as the analysis of tracks and behavior, John attempted to compile a preliminary description of the cryptids. They were tall, perhaps around 7 feet tall, with a slightly stooped posture. Their limbs seemed very long and thin, yet strong, judging by their ability to move silently and rapidly over rugged terrain, leaping over fallen trees and rocks. The color of their skin or fur, if it was fur, was dark or earthy, allowing them to blend almost completely with the forest environment. Their eyes, which he sometimes managed to glimpse in the darkness, reflected light like those of nocturnal predators, but their shape seemed wrong. They gave the impression of creatures perfectly adapted to living and moving in the dense, dark forest. John's key observation regarding the creature's behavior upon contact with humans was this: when detected, the cryptids did not attack. They retreated instantly, vanishing into the undergrowth. They did not exhibit aggression towards humans directly. They avoided direct confrontation. John noted this as a crucial rule of engagement for the enemy. They were not hostile towards humans as such, at least not unless humans exhibited hostility first. For John, this was akin to studying the rules of combat that this unknown adversary seemed to adhere to. Understanding these rules was critical for his team's survival. Based on the absence of aggression towards humans and the nature of the attacks on animals, John formulated a working hypothesis regarding the cryptids' motivation. They may not inhabit the area permanently. Perhaps they were migrating through the park's territory, using it as a rich feeding ground during their journey. Or they had temporarily established a hunting ground or resting place here before moving on. This hypothesis reinforced his growing conviction regarding the necessity of keeping information about what was happening a secret. If the creatures left on their own, the problem would resolve itself without intervention by outside forces, which John felt could be far more destructive. For David, these fleeting contacts with shadows that shouldn't have existed were pure terror. His theoretical knowledge, gleaned from books and the internet, collided with the physical reality of something utterly unthinkable. He was terrified to his core, but at the same time, his scientific curiosity, mingled with shock, compelled him to continue observing and gathering information to carry out John's directives. Sarah, though she experienced anxiety, was more concerned about John's and David's safety than about the creatures themselves at this stage. For her, they remained a frightening but vague threat. Even knowing that the creatures hadn't shown aggression towards them yet, John didn't let down his guard for a second. His military experience had taught him that a battlefield situation can change in an instant, without warning. What was safe a minute ago could become a death trap in the next. He checked his gear with double diligence. He considered how they could organize perimeter defense around their office or patrol pickup, should the need arise. He mentally plotted potential evacuation routes from various points in the park. He critically assessed their firepower standard-issue pistols, perhaps a pump-action shotgun in the vehicle. He understood that this might not be enough for a guaranteed kill against such mobile and powerful targets if they became hostile. Readiness for the worst was his instinct. Tension mounted with each passing day. John gathered Sarah and David in his small office, a place that served simultaneously as headquarters, supply depot, and sanctuary. The conversation was serious, his tone strictly business, devoid of emotion. He clearly articulated his assessment of the situation. "We have unidentified biological entities present within our area of operations," he began, using dry, almost scientific language, not to succumb to panic or provoke it in others. "They pose a threat to the park's wildlife. At this time, they are not exhibiting aggression towards humans who do not provoke them. This is a critical point." Then he announced his decision, which was both bold and risky, not to report what was happening up the chain of command, not to park management hundreds of miles away in another state, nor to federal agencies like the FBI or the National Guard, nor even to local police or the sheriff's office. He gave a detailed explanation of his reasons, drawing on his years of military experience. It was a military rationale for maintaining secrecy. If we report up the chain, forces will arrive who do not understand the specific nature of this threat. They will act according to standard protocols for dangerous animals, or, worse yet, for terrorists. They will create chaos, he explained. We will lose control of our area of responsibility. Outside forces will be making decisions without understanding the terrain, the entity's behavior, and the potential consequences of their actions. They don't have our observations, our experience in this territory. He spoke of inevitable civilian casualties. Military or police inexperienced in such conditions could easily accidentally harm tourists or local residents if they start a clearing operation. In war, the civilian population always suffers. I will not allow our park to be turned into a battlefield because of someone's incompetent orders. Most importantly, in his opinion, was the guaranteed escalation. Any attempt at elimination without a full understanding of the creature's motives will lead to an uncontrolled war. If they decide humans are the enemy, they will become hostile to everyone. Right now, they avoid us. We don't know what they are capable of if they are cornered or attacked. His words dripped with cynicism forged by service. Upstairs, they'll be thinking about political implications, public relations, paperwork, and funding, not about the real situation on the ground. He had seen how incompetent orders given from comfortable command bunkers led to tragedies and losses on the front lines. He didn't trust bureaucracy or desk jockeys. John established his rules of engagement with the unknown adversary. Our rules for engaging them are as follows. Observe, gather maximum intelligence, avoid direct contact at all costs. Under no circumstances provoke. Do not approach closer than necessary for observation. Fire only in the event of a direct, imminent threat to your life, or the life of another person. This is the last resort. For him, this was not a hunt or an extermination. It was a monitoring and containment operation. The team's reaction was predictable. Sarah, though she was frightened by the scale of what was happening and doubted the correctness of concealing the information, trusted John's judgment. Her many years of experience in the park and knowledge of local peculiarities suggested to her that he might be right about the chaos outside intervention would cause. She had seen how unpredictable nature could be, and how unprepared outsiders could be. David was utterly terrified by the very idea of creatures that didn't fit into any of his conceptions of the world, and by the scale of information suppression John was proposing. He understood that they were stepping onto very thin ice, possibly committing a crime. But he was completely reliant on John in the field. John's authority was absolute for David, and he didn't dare disobey. He felt the weight of this secret, laying heavy on his shoulders. The team began developing a more structured monitoring plan. They identified key observation points, chose positions with good visibility and opportunities for concealed approach and withdrawal. John spoke of setting up observation posts, OPs, in their area of responsibility, AOR. If they had the resources, he would install hidden cameras, perhaps thermal imagers, but their budget was limited. They had to rely on field skills and optical instruments. John constantly re-evaluated the situation. Every new track, every strange sound, every change in animal behavior, all was analyzed for signs of changes in the cryptid's behavior. He slept less. His attention was constantly on high alert. He felt a personal responsibility not only for the preservation of the park, but first and foremost for the lives and safety of his team. "We are the first line of defense," he said once, more to himself than to them. He was convinced that only they, being directly on site, understanding the territory and possessing the necessary skills, in John's case unique, could adequately assess and potentially deal with this threat, minimizing damage. This was the burden of a leader who, in conditions of total uncertainty and potential catastrophe, takes full responsibility because he is certain that the higher command wouldn't be able to make the right decision. On the periphery of the park, right near the boundary of the protected area, lived a man named Butch Henderson. He was a local, an old-school hunter and trapper. His appearance spoke for itself. Rugged, weather-beaten features, a sharp gaze, casual yet functional clothing. Butch despised the park rules, considering its lands his domain and the rangers' government stooges getting in his way. His motivation had always been game, the opportunity to prove his superiority over nature, and perhaps acquire a trophy to boast about. While outside of hunting season in an area that was effectively a park buffer zone, which he entered without permission, underscoring his disregard for the law, Butch began to notice the same oddities as the rangers. The absence of the usual game he knew like the back of his hand, the silence in places that were always teeming with life, and strange, unidentified tracks that didn't fit his many years of tracking experience. Unlike John, who analyzed events from the pragmatic standpoint of an unknown threat, Butch saw this as either a bad omen, a curse on the forest, or evidence of the presence of incredibly large, unseen game. Game worth tracking at any cost for glory, or perhaps substantial profit if its hide or body parts proved valuable. Butch's first encounter with the cryptids was accidental and shocking. Perhaps he was lying in wait, hoping for deer at a watering hole when he saw them. Indistinct moving silhouettes in the depths of the forest, moving with incredible speed and silence. His reaction was primal, animalistic, instinctive terror at the sight of something that absolutely did not fit into his worldview. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a human. For him it was a monster, a ghost of the woods, a devil's spawn, stepped out of the pages of old, frightening legends. The shock of what he saw quickly gave way to primal fear, and then to other baser emotions, aggression and greed. Fear of the unknown bred a desire to destroy the threat. Greed and a thirst for recognition, the desire to acquire a unique trophy. This creature, whatever it was something no one else had ever seen or killed. He decided to track them down, using all his hunting skills. His plan was simple and primitive compared to John's tactics. Find, corner, kill. Butch set out on their tracks. He moved less methodically than John, relying more on intuition and knowledge of the terrain than on painstaking analysis. He lost the track, made mistakes, but his many years of living in the woods gave him some advantage. He knew the ravines, creeks, rock outcrops that could be natural routes or cover. Perhaps he managed to locate a place where the cryptids had stopped for the day, or a place they used as a base. The climactic moment arrived when Butch chose the moment to shoot. Perhaps he saw that the cryptids were resting, or saw that they were vulnerable, relaxed after a hunt. He raised his hunting rifle, took aim, and fired. The description emphasized that he didn't just shoot a random individual, but a female. This was a blow to what was most valuable to the pack, if they had a social structure. The sound of the shot, magnified by the echo in the narrow canyon or among the rocks, carried for miles around, shattering the park's silence. It was an act of unprovoked aggression by a human. The cryptid's behavior changed instantly. The fury was palpable. The low growls John had heard before turned into piercing, inhuman shrieks. The creature's movements became sharp, swift, full of aggression. Their target became Butch. They no longer hid, no longer retreated. They pursued. The hunter, confident in his superiority, in an instant became the hunted in the eyes of the creatures he had provoked. Butch's panicked, grueling flight through the forest was a desperate fight for survival. He knew this area, every ravine and hill, but his skills were not enough to shake off his pursuers. The cryptids moved with incredible speed and silence, seemingly ignoring the terrain and obstacles. Butch heard them close by, felt their presence. Shadows flickered at the periphery of his vision. Perhaps he was injured during his flight, stumbled and fell hard, tearing his skin on branches, or even worse, one of the cryptids inflicted a non-lethal injury on him, as if toying with him before beginning the serious pursuit. Exhausted, bleeding, on the verge of hysteria, Butch, instinctively heading for the only safe place he knew in this wild area, remembered the senior ranger's cabin. He knew where John's cabin was, sturdy, well-equipped. He broke through to it deep in the night, pounding on the door and shouting for help. John, hearing the noise approaching, perhaps he hadn't been asleep, veteran habits and growing tension kept him from deep sleep, or perhaps his sleep was light, instantly shifting his consciousness to combat readiness, reacted instantly. He didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. His actions were automatic, ingrained by hundreds of training drills and real-life situations. He grabbed his weapon, assessed the source of the noise. He saw Butch, his state, his panic. In that moment, Butch was not just a trespasser. He was a something that brought the threat with it, whose appearance here meant only one thing. They were coming for him. Butch had barely burst inside, closing the door behind him, when the cryptids appeared outside. They didn't immediately charge the cabin, didn't mindlessly try to smash through the walls or doors like blind monsters. It was like a siege. Their tactic was described. They circled the cabin, methodically scouting its perimeter, searching for weak points, windows, back doors, perhaps even the roof or the foundation. They made sounds, low guttural growls, sometimes interspersed with something that sounded to Butch like an imitation of his own cries or other forest sounds. This was not mere killing. It was psychological pressure, an attempt to intimidate, to break the will of the besieged. John recognized this as an element of tactical behavior. They weren't just killing. They were retaliating and using terror as a weapon. John, maintaining outward composure, quickly began organizing the defense. He barricaded the windows and doors using heavy furniture, tables, cabinets. He assigned sectors for observation and, if necessary, for firing, though firing was designated as a last resort. He kept Butch under watch, perhaps ordered him to stay in a certain spot so he wouldn't interfere or do anything foolish in his panic. Butch was useless. Trembling, hyperventilating, he couldn't act effectively. Butch begged him to call for help, the police, the sheriff, anyone. John absolutely refused. His voice was low and sharp. He explained, drawing on his experience, why it was impossible. The arrival of armed people at night in an unknown situation, in a place where something is operating that no one understands, will lead to only one thing: Friendly fire, these entities being perceived as unambiguously hostile and the situation instantly spiraling out of control. They aren't ready for this. They'll shoot at anything that moves. His eyes were cold. This is my zone. This is my problem. I'll handle this myself. He didn't trust outside forces and wouldn't let them orchestrate a bloodbath on his territory, endangering the lives of his team, and as he now understood, everyone in the vicinity if the creatures became broadly hostile. The night of the siege was long and tense. Attempts by the cryptids to breach the defenses were described, tapping on windows, scratching at the walls, attempts to pry up the shutters or find a gap in the foundation. John and possibly Butch, in a fit of panic or self-preservation, returned fire, but only when a creature came too close or started damaging the structure. John shot with precision, conserving ammunition, trying to hit vulnerable points if any were visible. The cryptids might retreat after one was wounded or killed, but they didn't leave, remaining in the woods, encircling the cabin in a tight ring. The tension inside the cabin was at its breaking point. Every rustle, every snap of a twig outside made them jump. John continued his analysis, even while under siege. He tried to understand the enemy's tactics, assess their numbers by the sounds and movements, predict the next move. By dawn, the activity of the cryptids outside the cabin lessened. They hadn't fully left, but had retreated from the immediate vicinity of the walls, melting into the shadows of the surrounding forest. The tension hadn't subsided. It had only shifted form from active assault to watchful waiting. John understood that they hadn't retreated, but rather taken a pause, waiting or assessing the situation. They were still there. Their unseen presence felt like a heavy burden. Suddenly, breaking the oppressive silence of the morning, a vehicle approached the cabin. It was David. He didn't know about the siege. Perhaps Sarah, alarmed by the lack of communication with John after the night, had sent him to check. Or perhaps he simply arrived as usual for the morning briefing. John's and Butch's horror was described when they saw his vehicle moving slowly up the access road. There was no way to warn him. The new recruit was driving straight into an ambush zone, into the enemy's clear line of sight. The cryptids acted with lightning speed and coordination. Using the trees and dense undergrowth as cover, they quickly, almost instantly, surrounded David's vehicle. Their speed, their silence were described like shadows. They materialized from the forest depths. They incapacitated David. They didn't kill him, which confirmed his status as innocent, someone who hadn't harmed them. Perhaps they dragged him from the vehicle, stunned him with a precise blow, or simply terrified him to the point of losing consciousness. The hostage was taken too quickly for John or Butch to react. The cryptids swiftly carried the helpless David into the forest. John and Butch, under the cover of the cabin's barricades, were powerless to prevent it. John felt guilt, sharp as a knife, for failing to protect his subordinate. David had become a captive or a bargaining chip in this inhuman game. David's capture became a turning point. John's instinct to leave no man behind, a fundamental principle for any commander, kicked in. A commander's duty to his subordinate outweighed everything else. Fear, rational arguments, potential consequences. Objective number one became clear: to extract David. There was no time to wait for outside help, which, in John's opinion, would only exacerbate the situation. This was a rescue operation that, as John understood, could only be carried out by the two of them, he and Butch using his skills and knowledge of the terrain. John made his terrible decision. Assessing the forces, the situation, Butch was guilty of the attack. David was not. The cryptids seemed to be retaliating for the female. They didn't kill the innocent. He came to a cold, pragmatic conclusion. The only way to guarantee David's rescue and possibly stop the conflict before it spread was to offer the cryptids a payment. And that payment could only be the guilty one. His military pragmatism, pushed to the limit by the extreme situation, reached its peak. This was a trade, a deal, where the price was the life of one guilty man to save another. The climactic scene unfolded swiftly and mercilessly. John quietly, almost issuing an order, asked Butch to hand over the shotgun, perhaps under the pretense of, "I'll go ahead, cover me, or I need something heavier." Butch, trembling and still terrified, obeyed. Then, with a quick, sharp movement, John shoved Butch out from the cover of the doorway towards the cryptids, who were still on the periphery of visibility in the woods. He kept Butch at gunpoint with his service pistol so he wouldn't try to run back. John addressed the cryptids, perhaps with a gesture, perhaps with short, harsh words that Butch heard, words that pierced him with the horror of betrayal. "Here is the guilty one." The words were clipped. "He harmed you. He is yours. Leave the young one. He is innocent. We will leave and not return." The cryptid's reaction was described. They approached slowly, inexorably towards Butch. Butch's cry, a cry of terror, betrayal, incomprehension, as he realized that the man in whom he had sought protection had betrayed him. The cryptids approached and took Butch, carried him into the forest or quickly killed him. The detail was left for the novel, but the outcome was clear. They had exacted their vengeance and, seemingly satisfied, left, leaving David lying on the ground. The air seemed to clear of their oppressive presence, but the aftermath of the sacrifice and the horror they had witnessed lingered. John walked over to David, who was still lying where the creatures had left him. David was alive, physically. He seemed relatively unharmed, perhaps bruises on his wrists from being seized, scratches from falling, but his psyche was shattered. He had seen and heard everything. Butch's cry, John's words, the silhouettes of the creatures taking the hunter. He looked at John with terror mingled with gratitude for being saved, and complete incomprehension of what had happened. His youthful idealism, his conception of the world as a place with clear rules and boundaries, had crumbled in an instant. John's silence was more eloquent than any words. He didn't justify himself, didn't explain. He acted mechanically, like after completing a difficult operation. He checked David's condition, helped him sit up, untied him if the creatures had bound him. His words were minimal and harsh, devoid of any hint of remorse or doubt. "He is guilty. You are not. It was necessary." In his voice there was no regret for Butch's fate, only the cold steel resolve of a man who had done what he believed to be the only possible and right thing in the circumstances. It was the voice of a man acting according to his own internal grim code. On the way back to the office, or to a place where he could contact Sarah, John quickly devised and formulated a cover story. Butch, fleeing a wild animal, or simply scared by something in the woods, had lost his bearings. He got lost in the wilderness, perhaps suffered an injury falling into a ravine, and disappeared. David had been with him, but at some point they got separated, and David miraculously managed to get out. John clearly instructed David on what to say. David, too shocked, too exhausted, and too terrified to resist or argue, agreed. He understood that his life had been saved, but the price of that salvation was a terrible truth and the life of another man. They returned. Sarah, perhaps already worried, had raised an alarm or was about to send a search party. She saw their state exhausted, David with a vacant stare, John with a tense, impassive face. She saw that Butch wasn't with them. They told the fabricated story. Sarah, an experienced woman, felt the inconsistencies, saw the horror in David's eyes, and the unspoken tension in John's every movement. She suspected that something far more terrible had happened, something that didn't fit within the bounds of ordinary ranger work. But seeing that David was saved, and perhaps afraid to learn the full truth, or trusting John on some deeper level, she accepted their version, perhaps with a heavy heart, and the understanding that a part of the park would forever remain a place of dark secrets for her. After this incident, the cryptids disappeared from this part of the park. They had achieved their objective vengeance, and, it seemed, had left, continuing their journey or returning to where they came from. The park gradually began to return to its normal life. Animals that had been hiding or had left the area began returning to their usual habitats. Outwardly, everything was normal again. Silence and peace returned to the forest. David was changed forever. His youthful idealism was destroyed. He had seen the true nature of the horror that could lurk in the wilderness and faced John's extreme pragmatism, his readiness to make an unthinkable decision. He continued to work as a ranger, but became darker, more cynical. His former enthusiasm faded, replaced by caution and distrust. His relationship with John became complex. Respect for the man who had saved his life mingled with horror at his action and unspoken condemnation. He could not forget Butch's cry. John lived with the consequences of his choice. He knew he had done something terrible in the eyes of society, perhaps even in his own. But within his frame of reference, it was a necessary evil, the price paid to protect his men, Sarah and David, his team, and his territory from an escalation of conflict that could have led to far greater casualties. He continued to fulfill his duties as senior ranger, but his view of the park became even sharper, even more vigilant. He knew that the unknown existed. It was dangerous, capable of deliberate cruelty, and could return. He knew what he himself was capable of to protect his world.